Everyone. This is Wayne Callan for Attitude Magazine. Today's topic, a mindfulness guide for teens with ADHD, seems like an impossible task to most parents raising a teen with the disorder, considering all its challenges. A racing mind, low self-esteem, getting bored easily, searching for something new and shiny. According to Dr. Christopher Willard, today's expert, the default reaction to stress, unpleasant experiences, or even just neutral experiences for many teens is to check out. Don't like how you feel inside? Bored with where you are in the present moment? Check out with something outside of yourself. A video, play a game, check your Twitter feed, scroll through Instagram. A recent study found that young men would rather receive 10 minutes of low-level electric shocks than spend 10 minutes alone with their thoughts without their electronics. I think many of us probably recognize our teens in these scenarios. Mindfulness and compassion, however, go against these cultural trends by emphasizing checking in instead of checking out. We're very lucky to have Dr. Willard with us today to guide us and give us practical activities to help our teens embrace the habit of mindfulness. He is a clinical psychologist and consultant, specializing in bringing mindfulness into education and psychotherapy. He has been practicing meditation for more than 15 years. He is currently on the board of directors at the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy and the Mindfulness in Education Network. He is the author of a truly wonderful book called Growing Up Mindful: Essential Practices to Help Children, Teens, and Families Find Balance, Calm, and Resilience. Dr. Willard teaches at Harvard Medical School and leads workshops worldwide. The sponsor of today's webinar is Brem Preparatory School, a residential college preparatory school helping students with learning differences, grades 6 through 12, recognize and achieve their full potential. Brem's dynamic, optimistic learning environment offers state-of-the-art technologies on a 100-acre campus, where teachers, in unison with therapeutic and residential staff, develop executive functioning, study, and life skills. For more information about Brem, go to www.brem.org. Little housekeeping. Dr. Willard will give an in-depth presentation about the topic, and then, time permitting, he will take your questions. If you're new to our webinars, post your questions in the box at the right on your screen. That all being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Willard. Chris, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Wayne. It's really fun to be here. I'm looking forward to sharing what I do know about this topic, which is really a favorite topic of mine, is mindfulness, sharing mindfulness, and kind of handling that challenge that seems impossible of teaching our kids something like mindfulness, especially when they're struggling with executive function issues and ADHD and ADD, and it can seem like, isn't that kind of like the opposite? So what I'd like to do is actually just start with a really short, simple practice, and invite everyone to follow along with me today as best you can, remembering that none of us can do this stuff perfectly. But where we'll start, this is called clearing a space. I learned this from a friend of mine, from a tradition called focusing. It says find a comfortable posture, sitting up straight, just like our teachers always told us to, and there's actually good research that helps us pay attention. When you can read, you can allow your eyes to close. I'm going to remove this. And become aware of the fact that you're sitting, and you're using back in the seat, or your feet on the floor underneath you. maybe a place you go on vacation, you've been, maybe even a place you want to go, or a place from a favorite book or movie. And as you imagine yourself stepping into this place, you also might just check in with your body, noticing if your breath changes or your body changes and becomes a bit more relaxed and settled. And pretty soon, even as you take a few breaths and the scene becomes more vivid, you probably notice, whether you've got ADD or not, that your mind is wandering. And that's okay. That's just what it does. There's a few places it goes. You might notice it running off to the past. What was going on earlier in your day, chaos of family or work life, all those little thoughts about the past. And just imagine you're setting them aside, just clearing out this space, this favorite place. You can always come back to them, but one by one, setting each thought about the past aside. You might also notice your mind going to the future. What's going to happen in the rest of this podcast? What's going to happen the rest of my day or life? And you can just set those thoughts aside as well, just one by one. Back to this image, back to this place. Your mind might be somewhere else altogether. That's okay too, just whether it's back with family or friends or back at work, just setting each of those thoughts aside. Continuing to clear out the space in your mind, thought by thought. And I'll just ring the bell once more. And as you allow your eyes to open or focus on the world around you and outside of you, maybe just noticing any difference in how you feel in your body after having done this and what's happening in your mind, and perhaps just feeling a bit more settled. So this is a way that I like to start. I'm a therapist, and I also do a lot of coaching as well, academic coaching for kids and executive function coaching for kids and teens. This is a way I might like to start a session, because we can start with a little bit more clarity, a little bit more focus, right? And for some of us, this might have been pretty hard. In fact, it was probably pretty hard for a lot of us. But it's just about practice and being kind to ourselves when our mind wanders off. And then another way that I start as well is just with a practice I call taking a mindful seat, which is about getting into the present moment by just becoming aware at first of what are the sensations that are here. Maybe just noticing one or two sensations in your body. Secondly, E stands for emotions. What emotions are here in this moment? What are the actions that I want to take? Do I want to jump out of my seat? Do I want to start this work? Do I not want to? Right? Noticing that, as well as what are the thoughts happening in this moment? It's just a quick way of checking in with ourselves, getting into the present moment a bit more mindfully, and getting out of some of that distraction that kind of carries us out. So ADD, kids, mindfulness, right? I think, we might wonder, like what's the real story here? Is this a brilliant idea? Well, it seems like it, but is this also maybe, totally BS, totally impossible? And so I think we all probably kind of come to this talk today with maybe some ideas about what mindfulness is, or some stories we tell ourselves about why mindfulness is impossible for me or for my kid or something like that. But I just want to share kind of the definition I like to use when I think about what mindfulness really is. And I like to say a few things. I like to say that mindfulness is about paying attention to the present moment with kindness and curiosity. And what I like about this definition is that we've got three elements here to what mindfulness is. And we teach kids anything, we start by teaching them the basics, right? Kids aren't learning calculus in kindergarten, they're starting with 1 + 1. Mindfulness also, we can teach, first of all, kind of some practices about paying attention. So probably a lot of you have been told to pay attention. Probably none of you have ever yelled at your kids to pay attention, right? No, just kidding. Of course, I do that all the time myself, right? But how many of us have ever actually been taught how to pay attention? The one thing we're doing with mindfulness is we're teaching our kids and we're teaching ourselves how to actually pay attention. Secondly, there's this thing about the present moment. And this is also, kind of important in mindfulness because often, right, our minds, especially the ADD mind, is anywhere but the present moment. It's anywhere but the here and now. Even if it's here, right, then it's probably not now. And even if it's now, it might not be here. It's wandering off somewhere else, right? So when I was young and in high school, I remember my mind, there'd be like a test coming up on Friday and it'd be Wednesday afternoon. And I'd think, I'm going to fail this test and then fail out of school and never get into college and never get a job and probably die alone under a bridge and no one's going to come to my funeral. Like I just end up, so anxious in the story about the future. That's kind of anxiety. Other kids may be getting stuck in the past or just, being carried off by some other distraction, just totally taking them out of the here and now. So we want to help kids come back to the here and now, help ourselves come back to the here and now, where we're not telling ourselves these stories that are maybe not so true. And secondly, the here and now, the present moment, we're actually happier when we're in the present moment. There's real research on that. But the research also finds that it's really hard to be in the present moment. In fact, there's research that says our minds are wandering. The average mind, not even the ADD mind or the adolescent mind, is wandering 47% of the time. I actually had to repeat that because half of you missed it. Our minds are wandering 47% of the time. And I like to say that, especially with people that struggle with attention, because it means that it's normal. Like this happens, right? You're trying to focus on the board, your mind's wandering. You try to focus on mindfulness, your mind's going to wander. That's okay. This is a normal part of the process, which is why this third part really comes in, this kindness and curiosity and non-judgment about ourselves. Because for so many of us, as parents or so many kids, right, they've got these stories that we tell ourselves. I'm not a good parent. I'm not a good kid. I can't do it. I have ADHD. I've got this going on. I've got that going on. There's something wrong with me. And it's about learning how to, just be kinder to ourselves and not believe that critical voice that so many of us have, that so many of our kids have, because of the fact that they might just be wired a little bit differently. That doesn't quite always fit with the demands of our culture. So not judging ourselves, being kind to ourselves, and also just accepting, okay, I've got ADHD, I've got ADD. What can I do with that? Right? What are some of the advantages to that? Right? And then we can really start to build, from more strength. That's how we might talk about mindfulness, but we can also kind of show what mindfulness is. It's a cartoon that you can find online. It kind of shows the human being over there on the left with all that stuff in their mind that they're worrying about, thinking about. The dog, of course, just the sunshine and the trees. None of that other stuff the human has. The human, of course, no sunshine, no trees, right? Just mind going everywhere but the present moment. This is how so many of us feel and so many of our kids feel. And what starts to happen is that the more we're kind of like this, the human side, the more we're going to end up being like this tomorrow. And we probably all had that experience where it's Friday afternoon, right? And we're out taking a walk. And instead of being with the sunshine and the trees, we're back at the workday. Or our kids, it takes them a few days to settle in to vacation. Or they're already worried about, what's going to happen Monday morning. It's like, hey, it's still Sunday. It's going to be okay. So coming back to what's really happening in the present moment, which lets us see the beauty in the world, right? The sunshine and the trees. But also, to be perfectly frank, as one of my teenagers pointed out to me when I showed them this, the human being, if they're thinking about all that stuff, they're actually going to miss, they're about to step in something that the dog is leaving behind. So it's noticing the beauty in the world as well as the actual dangers. It's just being aware of what's going on around us. And that's what mindfulness is about. And it's also, maybe it's about thinking about that stuff when we want to think about that stuff, but it's also about being able to be present when it's time to be really present. And that's what's really hard for everybody, but especially if you're struggling with executive function difficulties, that whole switching gears piece, going from, having to think to having to kind of be and relax, or going from recess into the classroom, or switching from math over to English, or whatever it might be, or from school to home. Those transitions are hard. So what we're trying to do is build a shortcut through those transitions to be in the kind of right frame of mind for what the situation might hold. And the other thing that's kind of really impacting our kids these days is how stressed out they are. So one of my kids sent me this meme that you can also find online, right? What it basically shows is that our kids are under tremendous stress, and the research backs this up. So actually, a survey a few years ago found, maybe surprising no parents in the crowd, that the most stressed out group in America is not the parents of ADD kids. It's actually the parents it's teenagers themselves, right? They're unbelievably stressed out. And we know that the stress is actually really going to impact their functioning, their prefrontal cortex functioning, their executive functions are just going to shut down the more stress that they're under. And I want to just demonstrate that in another moment. But it's like this slide just sort of describes a few things a kid might be faced with. But the next one also really shows, look at all this other stuff that's on their mind, right? Not to mention, their learning issues and their social issues and their attentional issues and remembering to take their medication and their family and, so much other stuff on our kids' minds. So it's helpful to kind of help them be aware of the fact that life is really stressful and it may be really stressful for them. And then to kind of recognize when they're stressed, because that's going to start really impacting their executive functions in really negative ways. So talking with kids, how do you know when you're stressed out? Right? And maybe also even, like how do your friends know? Like that can sometimes be more helpful than how do you know, or how do your parents and teachers know, and who tends to notice first. So that's, kind of helpful because again, this is really going to impact kids' functioning. Stress makes everything worse, but it really makes our executive functions worse. So in terms of, kind of demonstrating, what I'd like to do is actually go through a little kind of exercise I do with kids and adults. And what I'd like you to do is just make really tight fists with your hands. Notice what's happening as you do that with your breath, with your body. Does your mind feel open or closed? And then just let go. And then kind of collapsing over in your seat. You're exhausted, how you might feel on Friday afternoons. Again, how's your breath feel, your body? Is your mind awake and alert? Is it feeling asleep, closed off? And then sitting up straight, back to the middle, and maybe just holding your hands out in front of you, palms up, not too tight, not too loose. What happens to your breath now, to your body now? Does your mind feel open or closed? And just noticing how these different postures actually start to affect your body and your mind kind of working all together. And lastly, we'll take one hand, place it on the other, put these both over your heart, on your chest for just a moment. Noticing how this feels in your breath, body, mind. And you can just kind of go back to your regular posture. So what's happening here is I'm kind of simulating what happens when we get stressed out. And what happens when we get stressed out is like, right, we go into fight or flight mode or freeze and forget it mode. And adolescents could come up with another F word to put in there. But basically, we regress. We go back to this kind of caveman instinct, right? The system that evolved to keep us safe from wild tigers chasing us, but we're still kind of using this in other ways and not really thinking things through. So the amygdala, which is this ancient part of the brain, that starts to turn on, right? That's like saying fight, flight, freeze, get out of this situation as soon as possible. Now, what happens when we're stressed out and the amygdala is activated is it shuts down all the rest of our brains. It shuts down the prefrontal cortex and the insular cortex and the other cortices where we think things through. We control our impulses. We make a clear and linear plan. We're able to predict the future. We're able to, do all those executive functions that we're trying to do and our kids are trying to do. So that this is where we start to get into trouble because, our adolescent kids already have less bandwidth in the prefrontal cortex than some of their peers, and the stress is shutting it down even further. That everyone and everything starts to look like an enemy or a threat. There's even less impulse control. There's even less ability to kind of sustain attention and keep it on something for a while, and everything kind of gets even worse and starts to cycle downward. So what else is happening? We also probably noticed the breath starts to tighten up. Mind feels closed off, right? If you get stressed long enough, your digestive system and immune system shut down too. So that's what happens when that kind of posture where we're making the fist or we're kind of collapsing down, these actually create even more fight or flight, freeze and forget it response. And also for kids that are already struggling with sort of how they feel about themselves because the way they learn, they start to turn that on themselves. fighting themselves, fleeing from their own experience, checking out with even more distractions, or, on their phones, or, with, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or things we might worry about. Or they start avoiding, in other ways, with kind of like freeze and that forget it response. That's kind of like, turning into depression over time. But it's also not kids that are acting out and getting into trouble in big ways, but the kids that are maybe kind of sliding between the cracks, isolating in their room, homework's not quite getting in, they're sitting in the back of the classroom, things like this. That's maybe more the ADD inattentive type, which is what I had as a kid, than the more hyperactive type, where we might see more of the acting out and the fight or flight response. So, this is what happens as stress and attention, all kind of start playing off each other. The good news is that we've evolved as human beings. We've got a prefrontal cortex, believe it or not. It's in there in your brain and your kids' brains, even if it seems like it's not. And we can activate that through what are called the attend and befriend responses. And that's that kind of response we had when we're sitting up, palms facing upward. That's attend. Placing our hands over our hearts. That's like a befriend response. And I might call these mindfulness and compassion, or self-compassion. And this is also where we start to see other things start to change. The breath rate slows down, the body calms down, the brain opens up. We notice when we're in those postures, right, our brains feel a little bit more open. We can probably do better on that test than if we're just clenching our fists, right? And we're shutting down that bandwidth, that we know is kind of implicated in attention difficulties with kids. So we can reverse that process by teaching ourselves some different ways of regulating our brain and body together, regulating our emotions, regulating our prefrontal cortex, regulating our physiology. And one of the best ways we can do that is with the breath. Now, I heard someone say recently, and I would give them credit if I could remember who it was, but they said the breath is like a remote control. The breath is like a remote control. You can change how you feel by changing your breath. You noticed in that fight or flight posture I had us in, breath was tight, right? Even in freeze and forget it, hard to breathe. Open our bodies and brains up, right? The breath becomes regular. So you can actually probably tell how focused your kids are if you just lean in while they're studying and listen to their breath. Or if you're a teacher, you can kind of check in with each kid in the class, notice each of their breaths. Is it slow and even? Or is it like kind of fast and that means that they're probably not so focused or they're struggling, right? They're in that fight or flight mode. If it's slow and even, they're actually focusing. And the research backs this up too. So Kelly McGonigal, who's given some wonderful TED Talks and written some wonderful books, I learned from her that there's actually an optimal rate of breathing for long-term focus. And this is like kind of a magic thing to describe to kids. If you slow your breath down, you can calm your body down, you can open your brain up for more learning. And here's what it is. It's 4 to 6 breaths in a minute. That's actually not very many. But we really want to try to learn how to use the breath like a remote control, slow our breath down, and then it kind of actually reactivates the prefrontal cortex just enough that we can focus for the long term. Keep that steady attention, not that flickering, floundering, kind of bouncing all over the place attention, that we sometimes kind of associate with ADD and ADHD. So what we want to do is practice slowing the breath down. And don't worry, I'm not going to be just teaching us some breathing techniques, because I did have a kid tell me once that deep breathing is played out. But I will start with a couple breathing techniques. Okay, here's the first one. It's called the hot chocolate breath. It's about as simple as it sounds. And this can be good for, I say actually, that this is good for little kids. But what I've found over time is that actually teenagers really love this. They may not love it if their parents are teaching it to them, but as a therapist, I can tell you the kids that come to my office like doing this when they're not feeling so self-conscious. And basically, just hold your hands up like you're holding a mug or a cup of hot chocolate or a bowl of soup or something like that. And it's, if it's too hot and it's filled up all the way, what do you have to do to cool it off? Gentle, steady, long exhale, blowing across the surface and breathing in through your nose, smelling the hot chocolate or the soup. Blowing back out through your mouth, cooling it off. Back in through your nose, smelling. Back out through your mouth, cooling off. And then just letting your breath find its own rhythm. So it's using a little bit of imagery in there to help kids kind of see, you know, like we all know what it's like to breathe in smelling or blow out cooling it off. You don't want it to spill and that kind of thing, right? So, you know, we kind of have hopefully a positive association, whether it's hot chocolate or soup or pizza or who knows what it is that's too hot to eat, right? And that kind of helps kids make sense of this. That kind of rate of breathing, that's what calms down the body, that's what calms down the brain, that's what gets it opened up and really thinking things through, kind of, jump-starting the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain, where we want to be able to kind of process things a little bit more kind of slowly and methodically and maintain attention, right? So that's the hot chocolate breath. The next one I want to share, the 7-Eleven breath. And this is used by all kinds of people in really high stress, high performance situations. You can see here professional athletes, for example, using the 7-Eleven breath. I learned about this from a program called .B in England, and they said they didn't come up with it, and I learned from them or somewhere else that it's actually used by people like first responders, ambulance drivers, firefighters, police officers, military applications, and for those skeptical middle school aged boys who are going to roll their eyes and say, I don't want to do any hippy dippy hot chocolate breathing. Thank you very much, Dr. Willard, or mom and dad, right? No, actually, like this is used by, you know, these big tough firefighters. They have to rush into a burning building, right? They have to be able to think as clearly as possible and be incredibly focused in that situation while they're stressed out, and be able to also see everything, right, in a different way. The person I need to rescue is there, the exit is there, that wall's about to collapse. How do I get out of the situation as quickly as possible and move on, right? Your kids may not be rushing into burning buildings, hopefully, right, but maybe, you know, they're going into a test feeling a little bit anxious. So maybe, you know, that moment while the teacher's handing out the exams, right, and we all remember that feeling from high school, and we're getting more and more anxious, right? That's the moment you can actually be focused on your breath, right? Or backstage before a performance, or, you know, if your mind just starts wandering, just bringing it back to your breath. And the 7-Eleven breath, we can do this together, just breathing in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And breathing in, counting to yourself, up to 7. And back out to 11. And in, up to 7. And breathing out to 11. Checking in again, maybe taking that mindful seat. What are the sensations? What are the E emotions? The A actions that you're feeling you want to take now? What are the thoughts? Are they a little bit different after just 3 or 4 breaths? They really probably are. They really probably have settled. We've gotten ourselves into that 4 to 6 breaths per minute range, like Dr. McGonigal talks about. So the 7-Eleven breath, you know, is another way of just really settling things down, opening the brain up, allowing us to really focus. So that's another short breathing practice. And I've mentioned also, you know, the ways that, you know, this can help our brains. And I've found that talking to kids about their brains is actually really helpful. Like saying to them, like, look, yeah, when you've got ADD, right, this part of your brain isn't quite as active. It's a little bit slower to develop than it is in some of your peers, but this actually kind of jump starts it back online again. And you can actually, what the research actually really shows, research from Dr. Sarah Lazar, who's at MGH and Harvard Medical School with me, is that it's you know, we're actually growing new gray matter in these parts of the brain, right? So we can, when we tell kids they can make themselves smarter and change their brains by working hard and by focusing and doing these things, what we know from the research of Lisa Blackwell, which you can read about in Carol Dweck's book on mindsets, is that it actually changes their behavior. When kids learn, it's not me, it's my brain, but I can change my brain and make myself be able to focus better and work out that muscle, they start to change. I've actually got this kid I see in my practice. It's kind of a quirky kid, and he was saying, it's like every time I bring my attention back to my breath, when it wanders, it's like I can feel my prefrontal cortex like just getting a little bit bigger. And I love that because it's true. Essentially, it's true. And the kids respond to that when they start to feel empowered by these practices, that they can really start to make a difference in what's happening in their brains. So thinking about that, and also talking to kids, sometimes, I'll talk to them about, like, oh, maybe you're not having too much trouble focusing, but if your friend is feeling stressed about a test, or your friend is worried about focus, like, here's something you can teach them. Or, like, teach your little brother this. Or when I work in schools, I'll say, like, have the seniors teaching this to the freshmen, right? That kind of thing, to have it be sort of a cycle. Here's a little study tip. Or for teachers also saying, like, sure, cram the kids' heads full of all the information they need for the test or the SATs or whatever it is. But while you're doing that, teach them how to open up their brains and access it. Because if they get into the test in fight or flight, or in that just freeze, forget it, I don't care about this mode, right? Like, then they're not going to be able to perform. So helping them with some of these breath practices and mindfulness practices should be part of like test preparation. And so if your kid's working with a therapist or with a coach, like, or with their teachers, encourage the school, encourage all those other professionals to be bringing mindfulness in, because that can really help. And also because sometimes their kids don't always want to listen to us when we suggest it. They're going for those other sources, or their coach, right, of a sport. It's gotten huge in professional sports, the mindfulness thing. So activating the prefrontal cortex, quieting and kind of actually making smaller the amygdala, that alarm system, that's some of what's happening. So how this starts to work, we see this research on the prefrontal cortex sort of, starting to get bigger and create new connections. That means increased attention control, both sustained and selective attention. Can I focus on this for a long time, being sustained? Selective being, can I focus on the board and not on the spitball, or not on the conversation happening next to me? Improved working memory, which is effectively another word for attention, right? Kind of how big is your cognitive desk that you can keep things on in your mind. Greater impulse control, which reduces impulsivity. It also helps with mood, which we know, the ways that the ADD and ADHD can impact kids and how they feel about themselves. And so it helps them be more resilient to stress, which we know with ADHD is going to be, they're going to have a much more stressful life. So enhancing other executive functions, resisting other distractions. And one cool thing, and I read Spark a couple of years ago, the book about exercise and the mind and all of that. And it was talking about the importance of exercise to cognitive function, especially to attention. And mindfulness practice actually means people enjoy exercise more. Mindfulness also means people remember to take their medication more. And we know that's going to be critical for some, of our kids who are struggling with this stuff. And it's going to be helpful for parents as well to feel less stressed out by their kid who's maybe having challenges. The insular cortex is also being affected by mindfulness, also seeing growth in gray matter in that part of the brain. That's where our self-awareness lies. That's where self-monitoring lies. How many of us or our kids with ADHD kind of struggle with some of that self-awareness or self-monitoring, where we tell our kids you need a little more self-awareness, like be aware of, kind of read the social cues, that kind of thing. And actually that's the part of the brain where that happens. We read those social cues as well as understanding where people are coming from. So there's so many benefits in terms of where mindfulness can help. I'll just maybe lead us through a couple more sort of short activities here. Another practice I like a lot, this is called stop. And it just means every so often, and maybe when you drive by a stop sign or you put a couple around your house, or teachers move them around a classroom and your eye catches that stop sign, just stop what you're doing. Take a breath. Feeling that breath go all the way in. Feeling that breath go all the way out. Observe your surroundings. What's really here in this moment? Observe yourself. How can I match the moment? and then just proceed with your day. That's the stop practice. Another one I like to teach teens and tweens, it's a silent sigh. A sigh is a way of letting out excess frustration, annoyance, irritation, right? All of that. We all know what it's like to be able to just let out a sigh. It also kind of calms down our body, that the vibrations of a sigh that massage our organs. And so, we can do that. If you have teenagers, then you certainly have had the experience where they sigh at you, right? Like, Mom, Dad, Dr. Willard, you're so annoying. So I'll teach kids sometimes the silent sigh. If you're so annoyed at your mom or dad, right? You can do a silent stealth sigh and not get in trouble. Just breathe in, and then just a long, silent sigh all the way out to the bottom of your breath. Mom and Dad, you're so lame, so annoying, but I'm not going to say it out loud, and just pressing the air out. And then letting your breath reset itself again at that lower, slower pace, 4 to 6 breaths in a minute, really calms us down, be able to see clearly, and get the brain working a little bit again and get rid of some of that frustration that's there that we all experience, but especially when we're, struggling with attention and controlling impulses. Try that sigh before you lash out. The other thing I wanted to just kind of point out is that, this stuff doesn't have to take all that long, right? So, we do have all these little moments in the day where we can find to bring in a little bit of mindfulness, right? First thing in the morning, last thing at night, right? Every time the phone buzzes. In fact, every time we get out our phone, that's a good moment to sort of take a couple breaths, or maybe just feel your feet on the floor underneath you. Noticing sensations. Are your feet warm or cool? Is the ground hard or soft? Is the, does your left foot feel different from your right foot? That's getting into our bodies, getting into the moment, right? As we're waiting, press that elevator button and wait, or, like waiting for the teacher to hand out exams, or waiting on the soccer sidelines, or in the outfield, right? Getting your head back into the game, right? Instead of wandering off. These are some of those moments. So many folks practicing mindfulness, athletes, politicians. This is huge in the business world these days. Another way to think about getting kids to buy into mindfulness. And so, another practice that I really like is simply listening to sounds. This is one I prescribe a lot for kids with attention difficulties. I'll guide us through this. So again, starting kind of sitting up straight, and you can let your eyes close if you like, and I'll ring the bell. And as I ring the bell, see if you can listen and hear the beginning, middle, and end sound of the bell. And as the bell fades, perhaps noticing what's the farthest away sound you can hear. Maybe it's the cars outside. What's a closer sound you can hear, maybe inside the building? You can hear footsteps in the distance inside the room, coming a bit closer still. I can hear the clock ticking. Closer still, I can hear the sound of my voice, sound of my own breath. Closer still, the sound of your heartbeat. Perhaps the sound of your own thoughts. And so this is really teaching us and our kids how to kind of zoom in, right? If your kid's already kind of focused on the bird chirping outside or the cars driving by, meet them there. That's where their mind is. And then gradually learn how to kind of bring that in a little bit closer, bring it into the room, into what's happening in the present moment, in your body, your heartbeat, and then kind of looking out, at the blank sheet of paper in front of you, or at the chalkboard in front of you, whatever might be happening in class. So we can also just do these short practices, just noticing a pleasant thing around us, paying attention to our senses, right? Listening to music mindfully, just focusing on your favorite song, Listen to, just maybe the guitar or just maybe the drums. Just see if you can focus on that for the whole song. It's a way of teaching yourself how to focus, how to pay attention, bring your mind back to that drum beat over and over again as you listen to the song. So why mindfulness? To me, we're empowering our kids by teaching them mindfulness, right? We're saying, like to pay attention. Well, this is teaching them how. We're saying regulate your impulses. Well, this is teaching them how to actually do those things, right? It's simple and cheap and portable. They can take this wherever they're going, right? To school or to driver's ed or wherever it is they might be going in life. It's about checking in rather than checking out from their experiences, right? Coming back to that, about connecting rather than disconnecting. There's the incredible evidence behind this, and really does build lifelong resilience. And lastly, another way I talk about mindfulness with kids is this is about single tasking rather than multitasking. And we all fall prey to the multitasking trap where we're getting half as much done. And it actually takes us twice as much time, but it feels good because we're switching tasks all the time, right? We get that little dopamine hit, but just slowing down and doing one thing at a time. In fact, a friend of mine was having a day of mindfulness at in his town, and he didn't call it a day of mindfulness. He just called it do one thing at a time day. So it can just be about slowing down. It doesn't have to mean hours of breathing on the cushion. It can be something really simple. Like I found this meme online, and it says, there's this guy at the coffee shop sitting at a table, not on his phone, not on a laptop, just drinking his coffee like a psychopath, right? It's rare that we see this. But this is the way that we can actually bring more informal mindfulness to what we're doing as we're eating, just eating, as we're doing our work, just doing our work, as we're listening to music, just listening to music. Just doing this occasionally throughout our days is a way to bring more mindfulness to everything that we're doing, adults and kids. So to me, that's where mindfulness can be so helpful. Our kids are going to get stressed out. Our kids are going to have their minds wander, but learning how to be kinder to themselves when that happens, learning how to get curious about their experience, to be in the present moment, and ultimately to learn how to pay attention. So that's a bit of my shtick, my show about where mindfulness can really help you and your kids in daily life, facing the challenges of attention deficits.
Well, that was great, Chris. A lot of great insights, a lot of great practices. As you would guess, there are some questions here from the audience, so I'll just start in if you don't mind. Or are you still talking?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
No, I'm all set. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, one mom asks, it's too difficult to explain to my teen the benefits of meditation. What is your recommendation to approach him with the opportunities of mindfulness and meditation to improve his studies and behavior? Actually, we've had several questions about this, which is basically how do you, my kid doesn't want to listen to me, never mind listen to me
right.
about mindfulness. So I thought you might have some kind of script. I know it's not one size fits all, but something that might get into their heads and make them a little more open to it.
Well, I do think, some of the apps can be helpful. I've had some kids really respond well to just like downloading some of the mindfulness apps that can kind of get them inspired and get them excited. Another thing I think is kind of pointing out, look, it's not just your lame mom and dad or therapists who think mindfulness is great, but look at these athletes, look at these pop stars, look at these, top people in the business world and these other places who are maybe practicing some of this stuff. Maybe, they're onto something. And then I think also like to be getting some of the other adults in a kid's life on board with this. One of the things that's hard about being the parent of a teenager is they don't want to listen to you about anything, let alone about mindfulness. And if they have ADD, then they kind of can't listen to you some of the time about any of those things anyway. But they do, kids go through this development where they start looking to other adults as models and then ultimately kind of come back to you as models. Like at some point in their 20s, they do reconnect. But that's where like it's important that they have like maybe a therapist in their life, maybe an executive function coach in their life who they really trust, maybe one or two teachers or tutors at school. And these are some of the people also that you can kind of sideways approach around, hey, I read this thing about mindfulness, can we actually put that into the IEP? for my kid, hey, like coach so-and-so, the soccer coach or the ice skating coach, can you think about, have you sort of seen some of the stuff about mindfulness in sports? Because there's some wonderful books and resources. There's a guy named George Mumford who wrote a book called The Mindful Athlete. He's worked with amazing winning sports teams, the Lakers, the Bulls, the Seahawks, mental fitness training, he calls it. My friend Amy Saltzman wrote a book called The Still Quiet Place for student athletes. So it's about kids and mindfulness in sports. The drama teacher, if your kids are into that, like whenever I go and speak at a school, actually the people who come up to me the most are the English teachers, the drama teachers, and the athletic coaches. But the drama teachers are often saying, this is the kind of stuff that we did, as drama warm-ups. We just hadn't really called it mindfulness. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. It's training your attention. It's training presence. So those are some of the other ways to talk to kids. Like they might not care about missing out on what the teacher is saying, but maybe they do care about missing out on the fly ball that's coming at them in the outfield, or they care about missing out on that cute boy or girl walking by them in the hallway. That's a pretty important one for a lot of our teenagers, right? So learning how to focus and pay attention to some of the things that interest them, which of course are different than what we adults think they should be paying attention to. So where do we kind of overlap with them? So that would be some of my thoughts on that.
Okay. As a sort of separate task or favor, could you possibly put, and we could possibly get it in front of the audience today, apps and books and videos that you highly recommend? Maybe, 10 at some point?
Yeah, so I could send you a list.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Off the top of my head, the Mindful Athlete is Still Quiet Place for athletes. Let's see. I've written a couple of books about mindfulness. A couple of them are specifically for teenagers.
Okay.
Amy Saltzman's written a workbook for teenagers.
I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot now. No, if you just come up, with 10 or 12 things, and then we can get them to the audience here, and then they can make use of them. There's another question about sleep. My daughter has trouble getting to sleep and staying asleep. Many teens with ADHD have the challenge. Do you have any mindfulness activities to help her approach sleep more constructively?
So I think starting with sleep hygiene, and that's sort of like, don't exercise too close to bed, don't eat too close to bed, have a wind down time, have a consistent bedtime and wake up time, as well as a consistent screen bedtime, maybe an hour or two before bedtime. Hard one to enforce, but important. And then as far as mindfulness goes, I think, like a long guided visualization, you can find them on YouTube, you can download them, you can get them from some of these different apps that are out there. Something I recommend is more like either a visualization or like a progressive muscle relaxation. Those can be really great just for helping kids get themselves to sleep, as well as regulating their breath down, as well as when kids are feeling kind of anxious and agitated, which is part of what happens with insomnia. Insomnia is actually something of an anxiety disorder. You start thinking, I'm not going to be able to sleep, and oh my gosh. And of course, kids with ADHD, they can think of like 1,000 things that are going to go wrong when they don't get enough sleep that night because their mind is bouncing everywhere, right? Creative kids actually have more anxiety. And so, doing things that are self-soothing like that. And what's really helpful is actually that gesture that we made where we just placed our hands over our heart. That actually really calms down the nervous system. It's like giving yourself a hug or getting a hug. It actually shuts off cortisol and actually allows oxytocin to start to flow, which allows us to feel safe and warm and comfortable enough to fall asleep. We're anxious, right? Just evolutionarily, we don't want to go to sleep. So I'd recommend that, but mostly I'd recommend like something like a body scan or progressive muscle relaxation. You can find scripts for those online. You can find some different recordings of those, I'm sure, online pretty easily. Yeah, like John Kabat-Zinn's stuff is good, and Herbert Benson's old tapes are good. Those kinds of folks and those kinds of practices, 10, 20 minutes, yeah.
Okay. Another parent asks, how long and how many times does my son have to do mindfulness during the week? But you seem to, have evolved it into a lifestyle thing, an everyday thing. I don't know. They want to know. I'm big on the everyday thing, but I'm also big on not pushing kids too hard to do stuff that they don't like.
I mean, especially, I mean, as it relates to mindfulness, right? I mean, they have to do stuff they don't like, right? But what I want for kids is for them to like grow up with a positive association of mindfulness, not like, oh, my stupid teacher, my stupid parents, my stupid therapist made me do this mindfulness thing and it was so lame. Like what I want is for them to reach adulthood thinking, oh, that mindfulness thing is pretty helpful, or it wasn't even so bad.
Yeah.
And so that's where I say, like, let's start really little, like start with a couple minutes, 2 minutes before you start your homework, talk about it as like a brain warm up kind of thing. A little bit before a test, or, maybe before dinner, maybe before bed, where they're going to find it most useful, not push it too hard. And more kind of inviting them to kind of play with it, see what works. That's something I'd recommend. Yeah.
What about medication and mindfulness? Are teens who are taking a stimulant better able to practice mindfulness because their hyperactivity has sort of been turned down?
Right, definitely. And I do want to emphasize, as my friend Mark Burton, who I think has been on the podcast also, has recommended, like, this is not a substitute, right? These two things can go together really. Like, the best is to kind of combine these things, to have therapy, to have mindfulness, to have medication. That's all the research says that's the most effective. So I recommend that because it also helps kids feel more confident, sort of like, oh, I can do this, right? And not just suddenly feeling like, oh, what a total disaster, I'll never be able to do this. So I think they can complement each other really well. And they're really working on, some of the sort of similar regions in the brain. So that's kind of what's working there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is a more global question. Do you find anything in particular that works best in helping schools understand the importance and benefits of mindfulness? I guess she's asking how a parent might be able to advocate for it as sort of a general practice in a school. I don't know.
Yeah, I do a lot of work with schools, and I do a lot of talks for schools. And what I find is helpful is the research. So if you talk to schools and say, look, this study by Lisa Fluke showed gains in executive function, of kids that are behind in executive function, or this study over here showed, greater focus and attention, or this study showed better classroom behavior, right? And if you look at like the Mindful Schools website, they'll have some resources like that on there. Then schools start to listen. And if you're doing like a PTA presentation or something like that, talking also about the brain science, like, look, these are, I didn't bring them in this particular slideshow, but you put up pictures of like the brains that Sarah Lazar scanned that show the prefrontal cortex developing more gray matter. Like, people like sit up and pay attention in a really different way than just like, oh, this seems like a nice thing. And so people believe it. And if you can give people an experience of it. So if you can do that exercise, making the fists and letting go, or you talk to someone and lead them through, like, let's just like take 30 seconds and notice a sound far away, a sound closer in, a sound closer in, and sounds in your own body. And how do you feel now? They're like, oh, right? Like, what's that old saying? People forget what you say, but they don't forget how you made them feel. So if you can give them an experience of it, that's the best. But, parents, that's trickier than, Dr. So-and-so coming in and blabbing to the school or the PTA. But that's where it can make a difference. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've seen so many schools are doing this now, which is what's exciting. So also saying like, hey, district over there is doing that. Why aren't you guys doing this? Because like the next town over with their test scores is doing mindfulness. Like, what's going on in our district? Right.
One parent, what her suggestion is, why don't make mindfulness a family affair, parents, siblings, and everybody, in terms of making it sort of an anchor in the home, a regular thing. I mean, is there any research about family mindfulness and how it might endure or sustain as a result of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you can practice as a family, I mean, I tend to joke about, teenagers don't ever do what we want them to, but the reality is that they're craving to connect, even though they're also trying to like push us away. Right. And it's like, we ask them how they're doing and they roll their eyes at us, but they're so glad that we asked them how their day was, and they ask themselves how their day was. and so, bringing it up, and practicing as a family, especially if we start when they're young, it becomes kind of part of the family ritual, right? That's ideal. But if you can, you know, as a family, find a mind, like this is something I do in my work. Like people find me and find other mindfulness teachers I know and say, hey, will you do like 3 sessions with our family? Teach us some mindful eating, teach us some mindful walking, you know, 1 or 2 other practices, and like do a couple sessions with a local therapist and mindfulness teacher. You know, and that can be, you know, sort of a family activity. Or going on like a family mindfulness retreat that can really sort of jumpstart practice as well. Or just like, you know, finding natural ways in, sort of like being out in nature and just sort of pointing out to your kids, like, you know, like let's notice all the sounds, you know, let's just walk and notice all the sounds in the woods. Like, oh, I you know, notice how you know, this view looks different in the morning than it does in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
Just a ways of kind of bringing it in a bit more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One quick question, I'm not sure you have the answer on this one. Will mindfulness practice eventually allow someone to stop using medication? Is there any evidence or research?
It depends on the person.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence on that. You know, I've got a very good friend who struggled with ADHD for many years and started meditating, and you know, then ended up not taking medication anymore. You know, he was also like probably around 30 when that happened, which is when everyone's prefrontal lobes start to, you know, fully develop and all of that. So it's hard to say what's what. But a lot of people find it really helpful. And I think it's certainly worth, you know, like when people are sort of stable and doing well, saying like, yeah, if this is working, let's try winding down the medication, if this is helping, and seeing what the difference mindfulness can make, because it can also help people, you know, develop a lot more self-esteem around, you know, their own, you know, so that study about like you can change your brain, you know, like, and then people can feel confident enough to keep moving forward, and that can be really helpful. You know, is it gonna, you know, fully replace, you know, medication? You know, again, it depends on the sort of the severity of the ADD and
Right.
other factors in someone's life. So it's a complicated question.
Are there, I mean, this will have to be the last question. Are there any studies about mindfulness and self-esteem? Because self-esteem, low self-esteem is a huge challenge for a lot of the kids, a lot of the teens. I just wondered, you might have mentioned it, but I missed it, about mindfulness.
I off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but people generally feel better about themselves and feel greater levels of like self-compassion, you know, which is, you know, different from self-esteem, but that self-compassion allows them to feel better about themselves and, you know, like recover from sort of mistakes or, you know, quote unquote failures or setbacks and that kind of thing, and making people a lot more resilient. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's a plus for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that was terrific, Chris. Great.
Thank you.
Insights and strategies. You relaxed me so much I didn't know what to do next with one of those presentations, one of those activities. But thank you really for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Very good for all of us.
Great. Well, good luck to everyone out there, and feel free to stay in touch if you want to, you know, email me any further questions or, you know, however. So, yeah.
And I will try to get those 10 or 12 suggestions from Chris, and we'll get it out there to you. We'll figure it out. So once again, the webinar has been sponsored by Brehm Preparatory School, a residential college preparatory school helping students with learning differences, grades 6 through 12, recognize and achieve their full potential. Brehm's dynamic, optimistic learning environment offers state-of-the-art technologies on a 100-acre campus where teachers, in unison with therapeutic residential staff, develop executive functioning, study, and life skills. For more information, go to www.brehm.org. And for all the attendees still on the line, we're grateful for your listening into Attitude podcasts. The next webinar will be on Feb 20th with expert Peg Dawson, who will be addressing the teen brain on ADHD, a parent's guide to boosting executive functions and building independence together. So thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone.